In the first steps, we was just talking about single objects, and now we want to talk about the properties, for example, of my Active Directory account object. This is an Active Directory account. You can see here a lot of different values and properties, and this is what we like now to talk about. Mainly all of them are text values. Some of them are logical values, like for example the allow dial-in property here. And as you can see here, we do have some other objects. Some of them are UID properties, some of them contains XML values like this one, and so on. In the next steps, I like to show you what we can do with properties. And stepping into my Visual Studio, I create two different variables. First, one to assign property values to, which is my first one, and the second one is a text variable as well for something I call property display, which I will explain a little bit later. With that, the easiest thing we saw before in some other videos is to assign a standard value from a standard field to this variable. I take my database account object, I type get value, I specify the column name, and I say to string, and this returns the value that stands in the column CN on that specific object, which is represented by dbAD account. Another way is to put something into that specific column, and to do this, the next line shows me how. There is a dbAD account object, I say put value, I specify the column name, which is here description, and I add some text into this description field. This is the easy way we saw in some other videos as well. Now let's talk a little bit about more complex things. For example, I'm now interested in getting the container name, the distinguished name of my Active Directory container, from the Active Directory account I'm on into my variable for the value. This is a little bit more complicated because the distinguished name of the Active Directory container lives in another table, which is not the Active Directory account table. It lives in the table ADS container. And to get a value out of the ADS container related to the ADS account, I'm using something that is called the ObjectWalker. For that, here is my variable for the value. I start on my dbAD account, here it is. I create an ObjectWalker on the session, and with the help of getValue specifying something which is a foreign key relation, I jump into the ADS account table with the help of the UID ADS container column. And with the help of that, I'm jumping to the ADS container table, and there I select the distinguished name. You have seen that notation before. We're using that in templates, for example. And it is a standard notation to follow foreign key relations in Identity Manager. Doing so, I get back the value of the column distinguished name, which is a property of the ADS container, which is related to the ADS account where I'm started. Same thing could be a little bit more complex, which is the second example. For example, I can get the domain name, which is now related on a domain object related to the Active Directory container object related to the Active Directory account object. And to do so, the only thing that is different, it's the foreign key relation. I start on the UID ADS container than before. I use the UID ADS domain column on ADS container as a foreign key again. I take the ident domain this time from the domain object, and with that, I'm good. In seldom cases, you will find, as well in Object Browser, very interesting values you cannot find in the database once you use SQL to look into it. A typical example here is X marked for deletion. Here in this record, it is empty, but if I look into that and there is a value in there, the value is text. Going back to the SQL, I will see that in my table stands a figure that could be 0 or one of the others, which represents at the end a bit mask. To make that human readable, the developers was just developing for the different bits used here in that specific field a friendly text that will be auto displayed. Defined is the whole thing on the object model, and you can change that or configure that in Designer. So if I step into Designer, you can see here Active Directory account, X marked for deletion field, here we are. And if I look into that, there is a defined bit mask. And dropping down the drop down, you can see the defined bits do have different display values. 0, it's marked for deletion. 1, it's not found in target system. 2, contains locked properties. And that could be set by the system. However we do that, that's not of interest right now. The question is, if I access such a property with the API, I'm as well not interested to get the values back, because if I tell my colleague that is value 1 for X marked for deletion, the question of my colleague will be, okay, value 1 is great, but what the hell is value 1? So I need more or less the display not found in the target system, for example. And to get that in the API, I have to do a little bit more work than to get only the property. You can see that here. There is a property. I get that, for example, with the help of getValue like before, but this will return the bits to me. That means 0 or 1 or whatever. But to get the display value back, I can use something similar on the Active Directory account object with the help of columns, the column X marked for deletion. And there is a method that says get display value for the session. And with that, instead of the real value, I will get the defined text back. The same, by the way, works for any column where a list of properties is defined. Another property you can find, it's a concatenated list of things. For example, I'm looking here on an Exchange mailbox object of Herwig Abele. Here we are. And you can see the email addresses field. And in the email addresses field, there's not just one email address, there are a bunch of them. So if I open that specific field, you can see that is something we name a multi-value property. So there are many values in that property, different values, and they represent different SMTP addresses. This is what I can do here as well in the One Identity Manager in several places. And the question is how to handle and how to work with these multi-value properties. I like to show you that on a multi-value property that says other mailboxes. Here we are. And the first thing, if I want to work with that, is that I have to define an object that could contain multi-value properties, which is my MVP other mailbox variable as a multi-value property. You can see that here. And I bound that on the object DB account getValue other mailboxes. I was not showing that example, especially because in my system, the other mailboxes field is empty, so you cannot see any values. But at the end, it is nothing other else than a list like you saw it before. With that specific list, that means with that multi-value property, I can now iterate over all values, which is easy. You can see that. I use the for each loop like ever with an element as string, and then I just iterate over all of these specific things and write then the whole thing somewhere into my Visual Studio. I can as well check the whole thing if an entry already exists. For example, contains, delivers a true or a false, depending on the string exists or not. So if in that multi-value property a new address at example.com exists, then I get back a true, for example. If not, I get back a false and nothing will happen. I can remove items. Here we are. I can as well add items, like here. And last but not least, I can store back the complete multi-value property list into my specific database field. Therefore, I use a standard put value. I have only to assign the MVP other mailbox variable. And this time I have to use the property value of that specific list. Last but not least, more seldom used, I can as well get back the number of entries out of the list where something is stored. And that is what the last example here shows.